I don't think that privacy is dead. Privacy is kind of inherent in all of our social structures. So we need to keep privacy, but we're facing challenges in terms of that we don't know how to set up a technical framework or a legislative framework that is conducive to the aim of building a technical framework that is able to preserve control over identities with the people to whom those identities, from whom those identities kind of emerge. So I think privacy is a very important part of how we form our relationships with each other, but also with ourselves. So it's not about whether or not you're doing something wrong. There's just some things that you want to keep private. Like normally, an example you would bring up is what people do in the bathroom, or sexual relationships, for instance, are things that aren't necessarily secret, but you want to keep them private. When you have the online economy and a lot of the tracking that goes on in the internet, it also has a very kind of fundamental impact on how we are able to consume or get in touch with different types of information. So I know when I search for news via Google, often they will direct me to technical news sites, which is not in itself bad, and I often read technical news sites, so it's handy for me that they sort the results this way, but I of course also acknowledge that it gives me a much narrower sense of the news flow in society than maybe I would get if they did not do that. So I have some type of need for a more diverse information flow than that Google is able to provide me. Normally, a good security policy will also provide privacy to the citizen that is kind of encompassed by that security policy. So things like encryption, for instance, that brings a more secure communication, a more private communication where you're able to interact with other people on equal terms and you don't have to fear outside interference with the communication. And that is obviously good for both the individual and for the security. But then, of course, security policies can be framed in different ways. It depends on who you're trying to protect with a security policy. Are you trying to create a secure situation for a copyright holder, or are you trying to create a secure situation for a law enforcement officer or for a private citizen? It depends on what your security goals are. And I can think sometimes that ideologically, our political classes are not so good at framing security debates in terms of individuals. So for some reason, the government and the politicians don't see their primary function as protecting the framework that enables individuals to interact with each other very well, but they see instead their mission as protecting themselves and their own institutions. So the government becomes a self-preserving institution, or they see the role as protecting corporations that are based inside of the jurisdiction of the institution. And that can be highly problematic if we define security policy that way, and it's something that I would advise strongly against, and something also where we need to be much better at confronting our legislative bodies with the fact that they are making those assumptions and those definitions of what security policy is and should be. I can find in the European Parliament, and maybe also this is a tendency that I see from the United States, that we are a bit too happy to rely on corporations to self-govern themselves. So we call this like the concept of self-regulation in industries, where we allow industries to form coalitions of different companies that get together to discuss how they will uphold the moral framework of society. That makes very little sense to me, because to me the moral framework of a society is something that society in its entirety, not just a small coalition of companies, decides on, and the people that the constituents, that the people in a country would normally trust to uphold the moral values of society, like freedom of speech or like the Bill of Rights or a constitutional kind of right, are actually their legislators. So I can safeguard that self-regulation can have a point, and to some extent. It's not like self-regulation can be completely discarded, but the moral framework with the moral context in which the self-regulation takes place, I should add, is not one to be defined by the self-regulating entities. If you're going to have corporate social responsibility and other things, you need to have somebody who is actually accountable for social values, like a politician, or the kind of political framework, the manifestation of society values, to be responsible for that moral framework. You cannot hand over that assessment to corporations, in part also because we've legally obliged the corporations to be responsible primarily and have duties towards their creditors. So they will always be legally obliged to kind of put that moral value first. And either we would have to change that in the corporate law before we allow them to set up other moral frameworks, or we will have to face as legislators that it's actually our responsibility to build the moral framework within which other entities in society can interact with each other. So there's this old internet picture from the middle of the 1990s, I guess, where the anonymity of the online correspondence is praised by saying on the internet nobody knows your dog. But actually on the internet Google knows your dog. And they can profile that, and it doesn't matter if they pseudonymize the data or whatever, because the correlation between different data sets is so easily and so quickly done that you can almost always be singled out, discriminated based on being singled out and identified, and that can have negative repercussions on you. And it doesn't need to be even like negative repercussions on an individual level, as in your government hunts you down. It can also be negative repercussions in that you get discriminated in terms of the telephone company offers that you're getting, because a telephone company knows that the vast majority of your friends are subscribed to a specific operator. You will get from that operator very beneficial deals that other people in society aren't getting. It can be also that you're receiving advertisements only targeting like kind of handicapped people because you have some physical disability or you're visually impaired or something, that kind of stereotypes you in that it nudges you into a behavioral pattern that is typical for your group, and it makes it difficult for you to diverge or have enough information to diverge from whatever stereotypical pattern people of your kind of society group are expected to exhibit. And that would cause a very, I think, a very stale social environment, which is probably also going to be very conservative, and where it's difficult for people to be individual entities with the liberty to choose what they do and not do. And it's not something that is necessarily noticeable immediately either, but something that would happen like basically over time and be very detrimental also to something like democratic discourse or a free market, which kind of assumes that we're able to make free choices in what interactions that we're having with other entities. How much of a problem is cyber espionage for business and government is a very interesting formulation of a problem, because it depends on what you mean by cyber espionage and for whom you insinuate that it's a problem in which circumstances. So when you look at the cybersecurity strategy released by the United States government, it's clear that they consider cyber espionage against companies based in the US a big problem, but they're not really caring so much about cyber espionage against their individual citizens, for instance. This doesn't really constitute a large part of that strategy. So you would ask yourself, why do they define that problem that way? Also, how do they see cyber espionage against their own institutions? This is more unclear. Technology is a very broad field of different stuff. So is there a relation between technology and human rights? Well, sometimes, and other times not. It depends on. Like my electric beater, you call them that, where you whip cream, may not have so many relationships with my human rights, but something that enables me to communicate over long distances, thereby expressing myself or building friendships and having also private interactions. This can have a very strong relationship with my ability to exercise human rights. So it depends on the technology field. But in telecommunications and all of this information and communication services in general, yes, very much. And also the way that the technology is built is directly influencing to what extent and how much our human rights can be effectively exercised through those technologies or not. So I think that there is a slight tendency to ignore or at least downplay a lot the effects of currently existing legislative frameworks on how this debate evolves. So, for instance, we are very into commodifying information and communication between citizens. We want basically citizens to pay for all of the communications and information that they transmit between each other. We do this through the copyright framework. The trade secret thing can also be seen as an aspect of that. And those are legislative frameworks that already exist and that have a very, very large impact on how our common interaction spaces evolve. And I think it's clear that if we're going to have something like an individual focused, where we center on the ability of individuals to create the social frameworks and the social networks and exercise the rights that they want to exercise, we need to also be able to deal with the role that legislative institutions have in shaping those frameworks. Actually, it's not enough to say that the government or the legislators can be part of a multi-stakeholder platform, because clearly they have some competences and they've made some decisions, sometimes far back in the past, that now have a very strong negative impact on what our future ideological options, let's say, and courses of directions are. So, and I think it's not useful to downplay the role of legislators in this also, because you're removing from the legislator accountability and also the responsibility for having set up a framework that intuitively nobody likes and that isn't really useful for anyone. Because also, and this, I raised this during one of the panels, but it's actually true that a corporation which has a legal entitlement or a legal right created by a social contract imposed on them by politicians that provides them with a better situation with respect to other companies or to private persons, effectively has no choice other than to defend that right or defend the expansion of that right or the protection of it. So the corporations, by virtue of being the privileged, can't be useful parties in a conversation about how a new social framework should be set up, because we've also legally obliged them to not be constructive partners in that discussion. You can see this from the way that the telecommunications providers are arguing, for instance. They're always very quick. Like, first they will have this long rant about how it's important that everyone's rights is respected, but the fact that they always safeguard with it's important that everyone's rights is respected, but is a clear indication that actually the private sector cannot deal with these moral issues.